Reese Cooper presents How to Make a Chore Coat. Directed by Tom Winslade. Remotely. This is your RCI Chore Coat Kit. Within it, you will find fabric, snaps, patches, RCI sleeve patch, ruler, pattern, and an instruction book. Before we start, it's important you know the line to be following when cutting. The pattern included has lines for small, medium, large, and XL. The pattern pieces will look like this in the middle. S will be the smallest shape. This will be the closest line to the middle, XL being the furthest. It can be a little tricky in the curves when cutting. To make it easier on yourself, highlight the line you'll be following before you start. This will help be a clear guide to make sure you stay on track when cutting your size. Step 1. Fold your fabric in half lengthwise so that the edges of the fabric line up perfectly. Then, cut out all the pattern pieces provided super roughly and separate out the two collar pieces, the smaller pocket, and the rectangular interior pocket. Place your remaining pattern pieces, which is the front, back, hand pocket, and sleeves, on the folded fabric. Align the arrow on the pattern piece so that it runs parallel with the edge of the fabric. You can use your ruler to make sure that the top of the arrow and the bottom of the arrow are the same distance from the edge. Once you've confirmed the placement, you can place a weight on the pattern piece. Now cut out these first 4 pattern pieces. Make sure that you are cutting both layers of fabric at the same time. There are small lines on the edge of the pattern pieces. These are called notches. Make sure to cut into the fabric 1/4 inch so that you can use the notches as guides when you're sewing later. Once the first 4 pattern pieces are cut, you can unfold the fabric. Place the pockets and collar pieces on the single layer of fabric. Make sure the arrow is parallel with the edge of the fabric again. Place a weight on those pieces and cut them out. Now that your pattern pieces are all cut, you will need to mark the pocket placement. Find your front pattern piece and make a small hole with the pencil through all the corners of the 2 exterior pockets. Do the same for the 2 corners of the interior pocket. Place the pattern piece on top of your cut piece of fabric and mark all 4 corners on the cut piece of fabric with a pencil, using the holes in the pattern piece as a guide. Flip the pattern piece and the cut piece over to mark where the interior pocket goes as well. You're going to use these marks later to help place the pockets. Now it's time to begin sewing. We're going to start with the back piece. There is a seam down the middle, so you'll need to combine them. Put the 2 pieces on top of each other so that they match up perfectly. Use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew the 2 pieces together. Once you've done that, open the pieces up so the seam is on the inside and add an edge stitch. You can put 1 edge stitch or multiple stitches. Adding a second is called a top stitch. Next, we're going to mark the folded hems on the pockets. Mark 2 lines running parallel to the top of the pocket with your pencil. One should be 1 inch from the edge and the other should be 1/4 inch from the edge. Do this on all 4 of your pockets. Use an iron to fold and press the 1/4 inch seam allowance line and the 1 inch seam allowance line on all 4 pieces. The pressed folds make it easier to sew later. Once you've done that, we're going to sew the edge of the pocket that you ironed and creased with an edge stitch. Next, mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the edges of all the pockets. You're going to fold and press the edges with your iron again. Now place the folded pockets on the front panels using the markings you made to line up the corners. Stitch the edges and add additional top stitches if you want. Now flip the front piece over. Place the interior pocket on the markings as you did for the exterior pockets. The edge of this pocket lines up with the edge of the fabric. When sewing the interior pocket, only stitch the bottom and the edge closest to the armhole. Now that the front pieces and the back pieces are done, we're going to combine them. Sew the shoulders together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then add an edge stitch to hold it down. Sleeves will come next. An important note is the back of the sleeves are marked using 2 notches. You'll see that there is also a notch at the top of the sleeve and 1 notch at the front of the sleeve. These same notches are reflected on the front and back pieces of the jacket. Start by sewing the left sleeve. Line up the back edge of the sleeve and the body. Begin sewing the sleeve on a 1/2 inch seam allowance. As you're sewing, make sure that the notches on the sleeve are lining up with the notches on the body. Do the same on the other sleeve and add an edge stitch. You can also add a top stitch if you want. The next step is closing the sides and the sleeves. You're going to sew down the edge of the sleeve and the body to close them off with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to do the fronts. There are 3 notches at the edge of the front panel. The second notch marks the fold line for the front of the jacket. The third notch marks where the collar ends. Mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance from the edge of the piece as shown. Then mark 3.5-inch seam allowance from the edge. We're going to call this marking R1. Crease both front panels along the second notch, folding outward. The edge of this should line up with R1. We're now going to make an L-shaped stitch coming down from the third notch and across the front fold, 1/2 inch from the edge. Now make a small cut diagonally to the bottom corner of that L stitch. You're going to fold it inside out and repeat this on both sides. Next, we're going to stitch the front of the jacket. Make sure your crease seam allowance lines up on top of that marking R1. You're now going to make an edge stitch down that whole line. Next, you're going to edge stitch the rest of the placket. Taking the collar pieces, you're going to mark a 3/8 inch seam allowance around all of the edges on them, both on the top and the bottom collar piece. Sandwich both pieces together and sew the sides and the top of the collar along that 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure to not sew all the way to the bottom and leave the 3/8 inch bottom seam allowance unsewn. Next, cut the top corners of the collar across, like this. Fold the bottom layer back on the 3/8 inch seam allowance you marked. Press it down with your iron so it doesn't get in the way for the next step. Now we're going to put on the collar. We've marked point A and point B. This is where the seam ends 3/8 inches away from the edge of the collar. Now, looking at the jacket face down, you'll notice little indents on the front pieces. These are we're going to call point C and point D. You're going to take point A of the collar and match it to point C on the jacket. You're going to do the same, taking point B and matching it to point D. This will rotate the collar. You'll notice the notches in the collar matching up with the sleeve notches. Now that the collar is rotated and the notches line up, you're going to sew down the collar. Using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, sew down the top layer. The bottom layer is folded back from when you pre-creased it with your iron. Next, flip the collar right side out and flip the jacket so you're looking at the interior of it. Starting in the bottom left corner of the collar, you're going to stitch clockwise until you get to the bottom seam. For the bottom seam, use your seam allowance guide to fold and sew the collar down with an edge stitch. Next, we're going to close the bottom and the sleeves of the jacket. You're going to mark seam allowance lines 1 inch from the edge and 1/4 inch from the edge on the outside with your pencil. Fold inward along those lines and use your iron to pre-crease them. Looking at the inside of the sleeve, sew the fold down with an edge stitch. You're going to do the same for the other sleeve as well as the bottom of the jacket. Now that the jacket is fully sewn, we're going to mark the snaps. Do this the same way that we marked the corners of the pockets by making a small hole in the pattern piece first. The placements of the snaps are marked in descending order by size on the pattern piece. They'll be in groups of 4, small being at the top, medium below, large below that, and then finally XL at the bottom. Then, mark onto your fabric through the holes in the pattern piece with your pencil to get the placement. Do this for both sides of the front. Start with the left side of the jacket, doing the top snaps first. Pierce a hole where you mark the placement with a sharp object. Use the edge of a scissor to make the hole bigger if necessary. Place the snaps down and hammer them, following the instructions provided with the snap kit. Now on the right side of the front, attach the bottom snaps following the instructions again. Make sure the snaps are on tight enough and really hit it with the hammer if you need to. To attach the sleeve label, take a needle and some thread and just tack stitch down the corners on the wrist of the left sleeve. This one is optional. To finish the jacket, you can take the 3 patches included and just edge stitch them wherever you want on the piece. Now that we're done, put the jacket on a flat surface. It should look something like this. If it doesn't, I would try watching the video again.